Born to Annoy, From Rebel to Revolutionary. Chapter 3. Mr. Philip Carr. Mr. Philip Carr, Associate Member of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers and Associate Member of the Institute of Electrical Engineers, Engineer in Charge, Contracts Drawing Office, was my next boss. By now my class consciousness had developed to the extent that I had a rough idea of my position within the society in which I lived. I had also realised that the two main classes in society, namely those who owned capital sufficient to employ the labour of others, and those who had no choice other than sell their labour power in order to make that capital productive, and thereby earn a crust for themselves and their dependents, had mutually antagonistic interests. This, of course, is rather a simplistic and black and white image of a very complex reality, comprising many shades of grey. I could quite rightly be accused of having adopted a primitive Marxist stance. However, I was an innocent abroad and still had a lot to learn. Nonetheless, that is how I felt at the time. I lived in a world of them and us, and I instinctively knew my place within the overall scheme of things. I hadn't read any Marx or Engels at this point in my life, with the sole exception of the copy of the Communist Manifesto, given to me by Harry Brotherton. Even in this case, I have to admit, I had not delved into the historic work much further than the opening paragraph, despite its resonance in the era of the Cold War. There is a spectre haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. Nonetheless, despite my fairly decent knowledge of English and a reasonable vocabulary, I found words like proletarian and proletariat, bourgeois and bourgeoisie, with which the manifesto seemed peppered, somewhat off-putting at that time. I had, however, eyes to see, ears to hear, and a brain to comprehend. My aunts had many works of literature left to them by my grandfather. I had read Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell, and The Manchester Man by Mrs. Linnaeus Banks, both of which had given me an insight into the history of the city in which I lived, and the past conditions of poverty and depravity working people were expected to endure and labour in. I had also discovered a copy of Self-Help by the People, the history of the Rochdale Pioneers by George Jacob Holyoake, which I had just started reading. It didn't take much imagination to realise that the conditions Dad and myself resided in were not too far removed from the Manchester slums of the 1840s, saving we had water on tap, modern and healthy sanitation, and our own privy. I was equally aware there were still many areas, such as Hume, where conditions were far worse than those we suffered. Mrs. Banks's book, set against the early period of the Industrial Revolution, leading up to and including vivid descriptions of the Peterloo Massacre and the indiscriminate bloodletting by the drunken forces of the Manchester and Salford Yeoman Cavalry in 1819, I had found particularly shocking. Elizabeth Gaskell's novel, set in the 1840s, the period of the Chartist movement's struggles for the right to vote, I had found both disturbing and uplifting. I know I am in danger of becoming boring, but I think it is necessary to understand how my young mind was working at this particular time. Why, for example, did I find Mary Barton uplifting? There has always been a tendency fostered by the great and the good themselves and their cohorts in the press and media, to assume that the rich and powerful enjoy their wealth and power because of an inherited intellectual superiority over their more lowly brethren, rather than as a process of chance, including the accident of birth, or through outright theft in one form or another. Elizabeth Gaskell had a different point of view, resulting from her close observation of the labouring masses she and her husband, the Unitarian minister of Cross Street Chapel in the centre of Manchester, worked amongst, coupled with her intimate knowledge of the middle-class manufacturers she socialised and resided with. Before we get to Mr. Carr, I reproduce here the section of Mary Barton I found and still find particularly inspiring. There is a class of men in Manchester, unknown even to many of the inhabitants, and whose existence will probably be doubted by many, who yet may claim kindred with all the noble names that science recognises. I said in Manchester, but they are scattered all over the manufacturing districts of Lancashire. In the neighbourhood of Oldham there are weavers, common handloom weavers, who throw the shuttle with unceasing sound, though Newton's Principia lies open on the loom, to be snatched at in work hours, but revelled over in meal times or at night. Mathematical problems are received with interest and studied with absorbing attention by many a broad-spoken, common-looking factory hand. It is perhaps less astonishing that the more popularly interesting branches of natural history have their warm and devoted followers among this class. There are botanists among them, equally familiar with either the Linnaean or the natural system, who know the name and habitat of every plant within a day's walk from their dwellings, who steal the holiday of a day or two when any particular plant should be in flower, and tying up their simple food in their pocket-handkerchiefs, set off with single purpose to fetch home the humble-looking weed. There are entomologists who may be seen with a rude-looking net, ready to catch any winged insect or a kind of dredge with which they rake the green and slimy pools. Practical, shrewd, hard-working men who pore over every new specimen with real scientific delight. Nor is it the common and more obvious divisions of entomology and botany that alone attract these earnest seekers after knowledge. Perhaps it may be owing to the great annual town holiday of Whitsun Week, so often falling in May or June, that the two great beautiful families of Ephemeridae and Fraganidae have been so much and so closely studied by Manchester workmen, while they have in a great measure escaped general observation. If you will refer to the preface to Sir J. E. Smith's Life, I have it not by me, or I would copy you the exact passage, you will find that he names a little circumstance corroborative of what I have said. Although Elizabeth Gaskell didn't mention it in this passage, because in those days it was the norm and therefore not worth commenting on, what made her observations even more remarkable is the fact that these self-same working people, for they consisted of both men and women, were tied to their looms and spinning mules, their steam hammers and lathes, 12 and sometimes 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Yet they still found the energy to pursue their desire for knowledge, and such was their dedication when they stole a day's holiday, as Elizabeth Gaskell puts it. They were in fact risking their job and therefore their livelihood. These hard-working people were the intellectual ancestors of Red Maggie and Red Albert, Harry Brotherton and Johnny Johnson, the humble machine shop labourer who kept bees on the railway embankment, and the rest of the motley crew who debated around Harry's workbench twice a month. The very same people, along with Auntie Dolly and Auntie Beattie and my dear old dad, who provided my inspiration and prodded my brain into constantly asking the question, why? Over time, I became aware that Mr. Philip Carr, or Phil as he soon became known to me, was also one of these self-same working-class thinkers and searchers after truth, despite his current position as a senior manager and my then immediate boss. Phil had started life on the shop floor pretty much at the same time as Dad. His thirst for knowledge and a growing interest in everything mechanical had led him to night school, and it was through this method he had eventually achieved his associate membership of the Institutes of Mechanical and Electrical Engineers. No mean feat, because this was the equivalent of 2 university degrees. And yet, as I very soon discovered, he had not forgotten his working-class roots, or the friends he had made during his apprenticeship. So on the Monday of the second week in August 1963, I found myself standing to attention in front of this great man, a leading representative of the class enemy as far as I was concerned, my knees feeling like jelly, on my head tremor all too obvious. He looked up from the papers he was perusing and gazed at me with soft grey eyes from underneath a head of neatly combed hair, once black, but now the colour of grey steel. His momentary silence didn't calm my nerves, although his first question did. "You are Norman Cowle's lad, aren't you?" "Yes," I replied, my confidence instantly restored by the magical words. "I know him well, son. Grab a seat. Welcome to the team." I suppose I should have become used to this by now, but I'd been taken completely by surprise. Obviously, my theory of them and us might require some more detailed thought. His next little speech surprised me even more. I cannot remember his precise words, but I can recall the gist of his message, even though it was 48 years ago. "You will be working with the sales engineers, sat over there." He pointed to a group of 4 men, each sat at a desk in a row alongside the left-hand wall, as we looked back down the drawing office. Every other person in the room, all men save one, sat or stood at drawing boards engrossed in their work. They have the job of organising the tendering for new orders, and once they've won the order, they have the job of producing detailed instructions for the work to be carried out. You and your draftsman colleagues have the key responsibility of translating their instructions into a set of drawings, both general arrangement and detail, which will enable the various production departments to build the switchgear and ensure the customer is provided with the equipment required. Electrical power generation and distribution is a very complex and vital business, as you can imagine, Malcolm. The switchgear we produce is a key component in the chain from the power stations to the local substations, from where energy is distributed to every house, farm, mill and factory. Its manufacture is equally complex, and the draftsmen in contracts play a key enabling and explanatory role in this process. He paused and settled back in his seat for a moment, as though deep in thought. He looked up at me again, his eyes a twinkle. "You will come across people in these offices who believe they are a cut above the workers who wear brown or blue boiler suits. You will even find some who believe, because they wear a suit and tie to their work, they've made it to the select membership of the middle class. Forgive them their airs and graces, young Malcolm, and whatever you do, don't fall into that particular trap. It is merely a process of self-deception. Always remember, we are an essential part of the production process, just as your father is. At the end of the day, despite our clean suits and qualifications, we are as dependent upon him as Norman is upon us. The process of production is a social process. It depends on teamwork and cooperation on the part of all those involved. Please take pride in the fact, just as, according to this report I have before me, you take pride in your work." He smiled once more. "Have you any questions?" "No, sir," I replied, lost for words for once in my life. "Right, although I must say I'm rather surprised." "Why?" "Why? Because according to this personnel department report, you not only take pride in your work, but you constantly ask the same question, time and time again, ad nauseam." By now I was fast becoming confused. "What question, Mr. Carr?" "Why, not what, you daft apeth." He laughed, and then donned a grave face once more. "My advice is don't stop doing it. It will no doubt annoy some people, but they probably deserve to be annoyed. If you have any queries and can't obtain satisfactory answers from your immediate colleagues, I'm at your disposal. Now, let me introduce you to the sales engineers. I've arranged for you to work with Mr. Bradshaw. He'll find you a spare drawing board and introduce you to some of your colleagues." Thus began my final training period as an apprentice, and my introduction to a whole new array of workmates, and the renewal of a working relationship with one I had already met. I have already mentioned there was a female employed in Contracts Drawing Office. It was my old friend Sheila. Once again we had dinner together, and once again we slummed it by eating in the works canteen in the company of Maggie Bradshaw.